haven't really brought this up on the channel, but for the last few months, I have taken it upon myself to do one of the biggest video game binges I've ever done. Every once in a while, I'll get the urge to either play through a series I haven't played before, or replay through one that I really like. But this time around, I decided to play through every Yakuza game. It's been an interesting last few months. I've been contemplating making a video on the series for a while now, but I wasn't really sure which game or games I would do it on, since by the time I started wanting to do this, I was a decent way through the series already. But then I got to Yakuza Like a Dragon, which ended up being a sort of fresh start for the series, with the game introducing a new protagonist as well as a completely different style of gameplay. So I thought that now, since the series has had a sort of fresh start, I might as well use that as an opportunity to capitalize on all that time I've been wasting. So for a little bit of context, Yakuza is a beat-em-up series where you go around and beat up random people on the street. That is also simplifying things quite a bit, but for the context of this video, that's all you really need to know. With that knowledge of what the series typically is in mind, now we move on to Yakuza 7 or Yakuza Like a Dragon, and the series is now a turn-based JRPG. Bit of a genre change. I knew about this well before I even started playing my first game in the series, and that knowledge sort of kept me excitedly curious on what a Yakuza RPG would even look like, but also in the back of my mind I was a little worried because the RPG genre is relatively pretty hit or miss for me. Whenever I play an RPG, I'm either fully invested in it the whole way through and have a great time, or I just get bored and never really finish it. Usually the reason for me not finishing an RPG is because I think it's a little too bloated without enough interesting stuff going on to keep me invested for that amount of time. I am typically somebody who holds value in games that prioritize being fun experiences over games that try to cram a bunch of boring, pointless, nothing content just to pad out the game for a few more hours. So that being said, what do I think of this RPG that took me 60 hours to beat? The basic setup for this game is you play as a man named Ichiban Kasuga, who starts off as a pretty low-level Yakuza, who ends up taking the blame for a murder he didn't commit so that the people close to him wouldn't have to take the fall. Kinda sounds familiar. Eventually, when he's let out of prison, he has to figure out all the crap that happened while he was gone and why his boss seemingly betrayed him as well as the clan they were a part of. It's a pretty typical setup for one of these games, but later on I also feel like it starts to branch off and do its own thing, which is nice since a lot of the plots of the Yakuza games can start to blend together in my head a little bit. The strength of these games, in my opinion, has always been making likable characters that are pretty easy to root for, and the plots themselves are usually just okay. I would say this game falls pretty in line with that idea, but I think it does work a little better here since a lot of the beginning of the game is used to get you attached to these new characters, and the game does a really good job of doing that. Especially in a series like this where the main character of the previous games is practically loved by everyone who's played a game with him in it, it's a daunting task to replace him with a new guy, and I think they do a really good job. Ichiban very quickly became one of my favorite characters in the series, right up there with Kiryu and Majima, which is a pretty high bar since I've had a lot of games to get attached to those two. I'm not going to go super in-depth on the plot here because 1, I don't really feel like it, and 2, there are cool moments later on that I don't really want to spoil if you haven't played this game yet. But I guess now would finally be a good time to talk about one of the biggest parts of this game, the combat. Like I said earlier, this game is your typical turn-based RPG with a few Yakuza flavorings in there to make it somewhat resemble the series a little better. From the beginning, I thought the combat was fun, but the further I got into the game, the more I started to appreciate how it made me play the game differently from previous entries, even outside of combat. In the other Yakuza games, you can do things like upgrade stats and abilities, which is pretty essential, but things like weapons and gear, while still useful, were far from necessary to put that much time into. But in this game, I actually spent a lot of my time and resources upgrading weapons and getting new armor to better prepare myself for fights. And then we have the job system, which is this game's version of classes, but they have some of their own little twist to them. Every single one of your party members can switch jobs basically whenever they please, with the only downside being that you'll need to rank up that job if you want them to actually be good with it. By ranking up your job, you get all sorts of new attacks and abilities, and occasionally you can get an ability that your character gets to keep no matter what job they switch to. Like I had one of my party members who was a dealer for most of the playthrough, but I leveled her up enough in the idle job so that she had a healing ability she could use, which ended up coming in handy quite a bit. If anything, I wish that there were more abilities that transferred over to other jobs because that would give me a lot more reason to actually switch them out more often. Most characters have a main job that they're best at, and once you figure out what that is, you really don't need to switch it at all. Like, I never switched Ichiban from his normal hero job because it's just the one that seemed to work best for him. This system could give the game some good replay value though, since you could use different jobs in a second playthrough that could switch up the way you play the game. But like I said, I just sort of wish the main game gave you good reasons to switch out the jobs more often, since that would be a good way to make your playthrough a little more varied. I think one of my favorite things about this combat system is just the way they try to explain it within the world of the game. Instead of them just saying the game is a turn-based game, deal with it, they actually try to explain it by saying that Ichiban played Dragon Quest as a kid and it inspired him to fight like that. And then later on, he pulls a bat out of the ground like Excalibur, and from then onwards, whenever you enter a battle, Ichiban basically sees things differently from how they're actually happening, which gives the developers an excuse to put in a bunch of weird moves and enemy designs. Now, some may say that this means that Ichiban is delusional or mentally unwell or something, but that's not true. They're wrong. He sees things differently because he's awesome and he's the hero. Thing is, though, all of this stuff about plot and combat and whatever else, that's not really what makes a Yakuza game good. What really makes a Yakuza game good is the side content. One of the largest staples in this entire series is the side quest, which can have you doing all sorts of random crap. Like, I got this one where an animal circus comes to town and the bear escapes, so you gotta fight the bear. And then you go back later and there's a tiger and the tiger escapes, so now you gotta fight the tiger. Then you go back one final time and there's a monkey who escapes, and then the monkey gets into an excavator, and now you gotta fight the monkey in the excavator, and the only way to do that is to fire a giant satellite space laser at it. That's like one of the side quests out of 50. There was another one I thought was pretty funny where you fight a giant Roomba, but I didn't record it, so here's my best recreation. But those are just the side quests. On top of those, we also have entire side games that you can play that are almost completely unrelated to the main story and gameplay. At the beginning of the game, you have this can collecting minigame where you go around collecting a certain amount of cans within the time limit, and then you can hit homeless people and steal their cans, but they can also do the same thing to you because it's a cruel world out there. There's also this minigame where you're trying to watch old movies, but they're old and boring, so to try and stay awake, you have to fight off these sheep men. Then there's the business minigame where you have to buy properties and hire employees so you can make enough money to impress your shareholders, and then you gotta go to a shareholders meeting and try and get your approval rating as high as you can. And finally, we have Dragon Kart, which is an entire Mario Kart game inside of this relatively big RPG that already has like 2 other huge minigames inside of it. And then there's the Sujimon, which are like Pokemon, except instead of cute little animals, there's a creepy old man called Piss Wizard. So back to the question I posed at the beginning of this video, where I asked if this game would be just another bloated RPG, or an actual interesting game. I mean, I feel like the answer is pretty obvious. I shot a monkey with a giant space laser. In complete seriousness though, this game has not only become one of my favorite Yakuza games, but it's also just one of my favorite RPGs. It's obviously not perfect or anything, but what they got right, they got really right, and I couldn't be more excited for when the sequel happens. Oh crap, they already made it.